Hello everyone, Mr. Lopez here with another essay brainstorming video for essay number 2, just in the same way as I did with essay number 1. A few things I want to run through on the essay prompt, and then I also want to end the video by covering a few strategies for incorporating borrowed material, quotations, into your own essays, and sort of how to start to formulate works cited entries. So first thing, the essay prompt. This is a pretty basic essay strategy, compare and contrast. You'll notice that all 3 essays across this semester will be different approaches. Essay number 1 was a definition paper. This essay is a compare and contrast, and our final essay will be a different approach. Just to work all your different critical thinking muscles. So what I'm asking you to do for essay number 2 is compare and contrast how 2 things, ignorance and knowledge, affect freedom, the freedom of human beings to act and think as they wish. So how does ignorance affect human beings' freedom, and how does knowledge affect human beings' freedom? And if you've read our 2 readings for this essay, the Frederick Douglass and Plato pieces, then you know that that's basically what they're about. They're about freedom, the lack of freedom, intellectual freedom, and physical freedom. And then coming to a sense of knowledge and enlightenment, and how that sort of makes people freer. So something I realized in your essay number 1s, and something I want to make sure I remind you about, is how to formulate a thesis statement and what makes a good thesis statement. And for our purposes, it's pretty much as simple as a direct, specific response to the essay prompt. So if I'm asking you to compare and contrast how ignorance and knowledge affect freedom, a very acceptable, fine thesis statement would be something along the lines of, while ignorance affects freedom by blank, comma, knowledge affects freedom by blank. And so you're setting yourself, your reader up, your audience up from the very beginning, saying, I'm going to acknowledge ignorance and knowledge in my essay, and I'm going to talk about how both affect freedom. And so if you can fill in those blanks, comparing and contrasting ignorance, knowledge with specific words, you'll have a fine thesis statement. And a thesis statement, some teachers sort of demand a certain length. It has to be 1 sentence or 2 sentences. What I want you to think of as a fine thesis statement is somewhere around 1 to 2 sentences. If you needed 3, that'd be fine, but 1 to 2 is a pretty sweet spot. Just directly answering the question. How do these 2 things, ignorance and knowledge, affect freedom? Here's how, in 1 to 2 sentences. Perfect thesis statement. Make sure you understand, as I scroll through the prompt here, this essay requires no research. No research is allowed for this essay prompt. If you look at the paper guidelines on your prompt, all you can use for support, and what you need to use for support, are Frederick Douglass's Learning to Read and Write and Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And it says in underline there, you must use both. So there should be no quotations or paraphrasing or summarizing from the Bible, from your parents, from your favorite novel, from your favorite song. If you're borrowing ideas or language, it needs to be from only Douglass and Plato. So no outside material besides those 2. Something to consider related to your audience. For our purposes, for this essay and essay 3, we're going to assume that our audience is familiar with all of our readings. We're going to assume that our audience has read Frederick Douglass and has read Plato. So what they want, what your audience is reading your paper for, are your original ideas related to how knowledge and ignorance affect freedom. And what you're going to be doing is using the ideas of Douglass and Plato to support your own. And that's it, only for support. This is a long-winded way of saying there should be no extended summary of the readings in your paper. You choose only what you need from Douglass, only what you need from Plato to support your own claims, and then you move on. Some students like to ask, what's the ratio of borrowed material to original material I should be shooting for in my essay? In other words, can 50% of my paper be quotations? Can 60% of my paper be quotations? There's no rule, of course, but usually I would say, after teaching this class for a long time, A pretty sweet spot for success is about 80-20, 75-25. In other words, if you can highlight everywhere you borrow material, everywhere you quote from Douglas and Plato, and it only constitutes about 20% of the paper, or about 25% of the paper, you're on the right track probably. You don't want to find yourself highlighting everywhere you borrowed from Douglas and Plato, and it's over 40% of your paper. Because remember, we're assuming our audience has read the sources, is familiar with them. They're looking for your original ideas, only supported by Douglas and Plato. So about 80% new material that's your own, 20% borrowed. That's probably going to get you in the right spot of how much borrowed, how much original material. One more thing before I let you go, and this relates to how to quote and how to document your sources. All right, so these two examples here and here are ways to quote from Douglas or Plato and get those quotations into your paper without messing it up, just as far as formatting goes, messing up punctuation and subject-verb agreement, all that, and ways to avoid plagiarism, ways to avoid your audience assuming that you're trying to take credit for Douglas and Plato's ideas. Very simple. What you're going to do is use a signal phrase, so signal in your sentence that you are borrowing material. Where does it come from? Frederick Douglass. Use the author's full name initially and then last name every time after that. So Douglass and then a verb, writes in the present tense. And this could be argues or claims or describes. It doesn't matter what the verb is, but author, verb, comma, and then quotation. Douglass writes, comma, everything in quotation marks signals to your reader this is borrowed material, it's not mine. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. Close quotation marks, then there's a space here, and you have this parentheses around the page number from which the quotation derives. So where did this quote come from? It came from page 1081 in the Douglass reading. This is completely legitimate, it's fine. There are, I know, and I know you know, many of you know, much more complicated ways to quote. I'm telling you, for this first time in this class, English 111, this is completely cool. Author, remember what I said, you list the author's full name initially, last name only after that. So if this was a quotation in the paper, we would be assuming that Frederick Douglass's full name was presented to the audience sometime earlier. And then whoever's writing this paper wants to provide this quotation in quotation marks. And so they say, Douglass writes, so this is a present tense verb, comma, and then your quotation, directly from Douglass's Learning to Read and Write, and then the page number from where the quotation derives, in parentheses with a period afterward. The only sort of wrinkle is if you decide not to put the author's name in the sentence. Let's just say, for example, you've been using Frederick Douglass's name, like, I don't know, you've used it 3 or 4 times in a paragraph, and you think your sentences are going to start to sound redundant and blocky, chunky if you write his name again. So you might say something like, he writes, comma, and then provide your quotation. And so if your author's name is not in the sentence, all you do is simply place it with the page number in the parenthetical citation, in the parentheses. So here, because we don't have Douglass in the sentence like we do above, we put Douglass inside the quotation marks, inside the parentheses. There's a space and then the page number with a period at the end. Like I said, I'll probably, before essay number 3, review some more complicated ways, not complicated, but just a variety of ways to introduce quotations. But for now, think of it as simply as this. Author, verb, quotation around borrowed material, page number. If the author's not in the sentence, you need to write it complete, subject verb. So he writes, your quotation, and then you put the author's last name with the page number. And this same thing applies, same exact set of models applies for Plato. The other way you let your reader know that, hey, I'm borrowing stuff that's from somewhere else. These are not my original materials. The other way, so you have your quotations with your citations that says, hey, reader, Everything quotation marks, not mine. It comes from another source. Here's the source. Is you create a works cited page. A works cited page, for those of you who are familiar with it, is a page at the end of your essay, a separate, starting at the top of a fresh page document that lists the sources that you use for support within your own paper. In your Rules for Writers book, there is a list, and this is page 404 to 405. So 404 to 405 in your Rules for Writers, this is basically a list of all the different works cited entry models, ways that you basically can look at the model and plug in your own information into the model and generate an entry that you type on your works cited page. Sort of a tip, you could just look it up for yourself, but my suggestion is to go to Rules for Writers page 434 and 435. And on there, you'll see number 34 has an A and a B. Those two models, number 34, A and B, on page 435, 434, 435, will help you generate the works cited entries for your two sources, for Plato's Allegory of the Cave and for Frederick Douglass's Read and Write. So that's where I would start. You'll basically be swapping out your information from Plato and Douglas into the models on page 434, 435. And then don't forget, we have a sample essay in Blackboard, and there's a sample for formatting purposes, and there is a sample works cited page, MLA works cited page on, I'll put it here, Rules for Writers page 456 to 457 is a works cited model. And that is a works cited model that you can use for how to set it up. Where do you put works cited on the page? How do you indent, and how do you space throughout the works cited page? So this is the model of how to format your works cited page. And then here are the model suggestions for the two readings. And that should get you all set to hopefully succeed, for our purposes, the first time you use outside sources in a paper of your own. I completely understand if this is a lot to digest and you've never made a works cited page before. This is your first time dabbling in it. It's believe me, it's not going to make your grade or break your grade for essay number 2. We're still working on formulating specific thesis statements, succinct body paragraphs that have both claims and examples, basic paragraph and essay organization, introductions and conclusions. That's what matters most. But sort of secondary to that is, as we move into essay number 3, which is a research paper, how do you properly document your sources when you borrow? And how do you create a works cited page that lists those documents that you borrow material from? And so this is the first time doing it. How it affects your grade is very slim percentage-wise. So do your best, and I'll be happy to give you feedback on essay number 2 so that when we get to essay number 3 and this stuff, quoting and making works cited entries is worth more, we should all be much better at it. Of course, I'm here to help as you're doing this. If you have questions, feel free to reach out, send me an email. I'm happy to help. You can also set up an appointment with me during office hours. I'm very pleased with how the class has performed so far. A lot of y'all kicked butt on essay number 1, so that makes me super happy. Good luck. Again, if I can help, let me know. And enjoy this fall weather, y'all. Bye.